I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.
Welcome to Studio Sacramento. I'm your host, Scott Syfax. 2013 marks the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's historic I Have a Dream speech that captured the promise of the 1960s civil rights movement. King's call for justice, equality, and brotherhood has become a part of the fabric of our national aspiration in creating a just society. Today, we're asking just how much of his dream have we achieved, and is his message still relevant today? Joining us today on Studio Sacramento is Sam Starks, community activist and executive director of MLK 365. Arnoldo Torres, policy consultant and the former national executive director of the League of United Latin American Citizens. And Dr. Marion Woods, longtime civil rights activist and college classmate of Dr. King. Welcome all to the program. I want to begin with this quote from Dr. King. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Many years after that historic speech, I want to ask this group, how far have we come?
Well, we've
Dr.
come.
Woods.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. We have come quite some distance since King's death. But one thing I've learned in the 80 years I've been on this earth is that the things that King achieved and the group that he was with accomplished, we find that it has to be done over and over again. Each generation has to fight that same battle over again because it never ends. What his objectives were and his goals were are still laudable, achievable, and should be on the front end of our discussion on what's going on today.
It's interesting you should say that because, Sam Starks, you've said often that the dream is not an end destination, but it's always a journey. Tell us what that means.
Well, it's, I think what Dr. King did, he kind of laid a foundation, a kind of a blueprint, if you will. And it's the kind of proverbial onion skin that you keep peeling away. It's really American. It's very much an American ethos, that the idea of always improving, always growing, always developing. And I think the dream is a concept, somewhat ethereal, but it really has practical application in that each generation is presented with a sense of optimism that you could achieve more, improve, make better than your parents. And I think the dream fits into that American ethos very well.
Arnold, you know, when you talk about this optimism, but always renewing, what's the balance, the appropriate balance between celebration and impatience to continue moving forward?
I think that Mr. Woods has done a very good job of talking about the fact that it was really never finished. He spoke about his dream. Did he realize his dream? I don't know. I think, you know, unless he was here telling us that we really don't understand it. But I think the reality is that what he wanted to accomplish was not something that you had a set date and it was going to be done. It is a challenge because look at all of the things he had to do to bring this nation to the realization of what it had been doing legally under law was wrong. Did we really have to go through this experience when we have so many people who say they believe in God? This was what he was saying. If we have this belief, how can we treat people this way? It is not something that we to this day have continued to realize and say, you know what, we understand. It is a constant tussle, our belief in God and our manifestation of those beliefs in our treatment of people. We're not very good at it. And so that dream is still has to be pursued. It has to be aggressively pursued, which is a very difficult thing to do because most people say, oh, everything's okay now. What are you complaining about?
Okay, but if it still has to be pursued, and we haven't gotten there yet, why are we still celebrating his life 40 years later?
Because the courage that it took for he and those people that were with him, his colleagues, people like Mr. Woods and others, it was an accomplishment, it was an activity, it was a life's work that many of us have no real appreciation for. We have never confronted those types of challenges that many of those people in that era did. Life is much better for us, and we fail to appreciate that challenge and those things that they did and then apply it to today's times. We're a very, very interesting group of people. We're always looking for easy way outs. We are always looking for the simplest things to do. Mr. King and his colleagues recognized that was no way to live anymore.
Dr. Woods, I wanted to come to you because you were a contemporary of Dr. King. You went to high school with him, you went to college with him. If he were sitting with us today, what do you think would be uppermost on his mind about what pleased him that he saw and what frustrated him still?
I think he'd probably say that a lot of change has occurred. At the same time, things are the same. Some of us feel that there's been no progress. Others feel there's been a lot of progress.
No progress.
No progress.
We
at
have.
all.
Well, hold on. Let me
okay.
let me just speak to that for a second, and you can respond. The world's wealthiest man is a Latino, Carlos Slim, of Mexico. We just inaugurated the first Asian American woman as Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. The first minority, an African American, sits in the seat of being the President of the United States. No progress?
Let's put it this way. There have been individuals who have met their goals and objectives, and there have been accomplishments individually. But as a group, as a whole, the poor blacks, poor whites, poor Asians, and others are in the same place they were at the turn of the century in some aspects of it. The other thing is you have to look at this in the context of what the dream is and what it means. If King was here today, he probably would be astonished that the barriers are no longer visible. The obstacles are no longer right before you. Today it's a little more difficult because you can't see them. There are no people are not riding around in white sheets and hooded coats. They have briefcases and Armani suits, and they're lawyers and they're professionals. So in this way, when I say no progress, what I mean is a facade. It appears to be progress, but underneath the veneer, just under the surface, we have as much to do now as we did when he was alive. Sure, we have a black president.
Sure.
But that hasn't done anything to improve race relations.
Well, Sam, on that note, one of the things that Dr. Woods is just speaking to is the fact that for people of all ethnicities and backgrounds, particularly at the lowest levels of society, Dr. Woods says that progress has been at a standstill. We've seen the mushrooming of different types of societal movements, the most recent of which has been the Occupy Wall Street movement. Does that type of energy and that sort of activism speak to the arc between the era of the civil rights movement and the issues of today?
Change is a slow train. Change is a slow march. King's metric for social justice, equity, fairness, justice, would not be measured by an individual, but it would be measured in the collective. You got to remember, he first and foremost was an African-American preacher from the South. And a metric was the least of these. It was the least of these. And so he would look at the time now, to go back to your earlier question, he would assess what condition are the least of these in. He would see prisons, overpopulated schools, closing down. He would see divorce rates. He would see a real struggle and change in American value systems. And so when we look to the individual symbolic individual that has somehow managed to get through. Those are good and very visible manifestations, but King's eyes, his gaze, I feel, would be on the least of these, the collective, the masses. And indeed, before he passed his movement, he was looking at issues of wealth and equity, and he was looking at the poverty. And that was something that he was moving towards at the time of his death there in Memphis. So,
At the end of the day, Reverend King was a reverend, and he believed in God, and he preached the word of God, okay? So let's look at where we're at today. The way people describe how they dislike blacks and how come blacks have not made the progress. They're dependent on the American system. They're dependent on American government, okay? Hispanics, well, you know, you have so many that are undocumented, they always want something from the system. What have the Republican candidates been talking about, okay? The deportations by Mr. Obama's administration. The reality is that we as a society still talk about each other in the same way that we used to back in the 50s, except, as Mr. Woods has said, we're not as inflammatory with our language. And when we are inflammatory, we apologize. And as soon as you apologize, everything's okay.
I think you have to also take a look at what King's objective was. And his objective was to make the comfortable uncomfortable and comfort those who needed comfort. And that objective still exists.
Now think about it. He says this is a very important statement, okay? Because majority America would not agree with what Mr. Wood says. Absolutely not.
Well, let me just speak to that for a moment. There was a quote by Cesar Chavez in 1990 from a speech that he made where he said, "Many people will tell you," speaking of Dr. King now, "of his wonderful qualities and his many accomplishments. But what makes him special to me, the truth that most people don't want to remember, is that Dr. King was a great activist, fighting for radical social change with radical methods. While other people talked about change, Dr. King used direct action to challenge the system. He welcomed it and used it wisely." And so the question I'd ask you, Arnold, is this. Has Dr. King been hallmarked, so to speak, where he's been so homogenized that his work and his message has been lost?
Yeah, I think he has in many regards. It's kind of like Obama being elected president. You know, a lot of people were surprised that he would be elected. Well, the reality is that a lot of people voted for him because they wanted that heavy burden of, you know what, I voted for a black man, get off my back. Okay? And what's happened with Martin Luther King's history is a lot of people say, I bought into it, you know, hey, you know what, everything's okay, quit complaining. So what we do when that takes place, we begin to cheapen the struggle. We begin to cheapen the experience that individuals like Reverend King and others actually had to exert in order to bring about that change. See, this is what we do in American society. We will hold and lift up John Wayne and America's image of what John Wayne gave us. But we will not carry that strength that we say, the individualism of American society. We don't carry it forward. We don't carry it the way we're supposed to be carrying it. We cheapen everything because it's the easy thing to do. We live with memories, and the ugly memories are the ones that we want to put aside quickly. Martin Luther King talked to us about things that made us uncomfortable. It's just like Mr. Woods said, okay? He wanted to make the comfortable feel uncomfortable. But he wanted to then transfer that to us. What is that described now? That's described as transferring wealth today. That's how people want to describe what we're talking about. When in essence, we're not talking about that. We're talking about equity. We're talking about fairness. We're talking about if we're all in it together. There are times when the very rich have got to help a little bit more the ones that aren't very rich.
Okay, but in speaking to that, I want to go back to something that came up a few minutes ago that Dr. Woods raised. Sam, many people think of Dr. King's achievements in terms of relationships between white and black America. But in his 39 years, those themes that he celebrated, equity, justice, fairness, they were far broader in terms of their application than just race relations between two groups in the country. Where else did his message change American society and international
I think
society.
with all due respect to the members here at this table, they can probably go and add color to your question. But you know, initially when you think about king, if you're a woman, you're owing to king. If you're brown Latino, you may be owing to king. Asian, you may be owing to king. You're disabled.
In what way? Be specific.
Let me. If you're disabled in a sense, and when you guys were doing your thing, policy in the 60s, 70s, you know, we saw these policies that were coming across the table, and no small way because you had an activist in the community, and it gave power. It gave power to people to stand up and say, I want to be counted. And so when you look at the very specifics of someone who is a wheelchair ramp, when there's a ramp there, or when you can't, you hear people talk about PC. You know, oh, I don't like PC. You know, PC is, you know, PC is a good thing if you're on the other end of that statement, oftentimes. And in that sense, this whole dialogue, the policies are owing in a sense.
Doesn't that kill authenticity and honest dialogue by so much political correctness?
You know what? King would say, and I want to get this quote right, but in essence, he'd say, the law can't make someone like me, but it can stop them from lynching me, and that's pretty important too. And I think understanding the whole piece between theory and practice here, especially when you're looking at King, is something that policymakers and folks who've lived with him can speak to a little bit better than I, but he was very much a practical, his King is best lived as opposed to best spoken about or theorized about. And I think those are some of the pieces that, especially when you're looking at today in America and what's owed to the dialogue that King put on the American table.
Well, let me speak to that. Arnold, there is a strain of dialogue that goes on in this country about Dr. King, his legacy, and the aspirations of those who have not had their own version of the American dream, that the doors have been opened. You talk a lot about what hasn't happened, but you don't focus on what has. The glass is always half empty to folks who have grievances. Well, other people are coming here and they see the glass is half full and they're taking full advantage. Where's the balance?
I think the difficulty is this, is when you watch America's political shows, okay, who are you watching? You are watching one world of a society that has many worlds. The understanding, the definition, the defining of what is in front of us as a nation is never defined by people around this table. It's always defined by majority, always. So in other words, here's my point.
But let me hold your point. But I have to ask you the question. You say it's defined by the majority. But you know, in the 90s, the rapper Ice-T made a statement about American society. He said, well, what do you think people remember about the 90s? And his statement was, well, this was the era when working class whites found out that they were minorities too. Yeah. And so is this really a race issue, or is this a class and economic issue?
People will always want to make it much less than less complex. That's what we want, right? Easy way out, always, right? So we're always going to say we're all in it together. Yes, we are, but color of skin is a dog. Mm-hmm. It is always there. People want to say that it isn't. It is always there. It is not something that I like. It is not something that I wish was there. I don't like doing some of the advocacy that I do. I wish it was outdated. I wish it was done with. I wish it had been resolved. But the reality is that when he brought us to this realization, when he brought his issues to the table, these were human issues, okay? But they were easy to put off on one group of people, okay? It was a group of people, through their leadership, they stood up and they said, you know what? We say in Spanish, ya basta, enough, okay? The black community was the first to say that. Who followed? Women's movement, the gay movement. Every other movement followed, okay? Hispanic movement, okay? On immigration, we were recently going around saying, hey, you know what? Keep the Eye on the Prize, Juan Williams' book. Why? Because we wanted to take a page out of civil rights and apply it to the Hispanic community's concern about immigration. The gays have done the same thing. Gay communities done the same thing with their rights movement. So the reality is that it's always in front of us. What we do is that we try to make it seem like, hey, we're all in it together. But we are to some extent, but we aren't. And that's a decision that this society makes. And it's a game that we play. Because this is the best way to put it. Before, we weren't invited to the dance, okay? Now, we're invited to dances, but we're not allowed to dance, see? And I'm not the kind of person, if you're gonna invite me, let me dance the way I wanna dance. Let me contribute, let me be what I am. Let me give my 2 bits to it. But American society is still stuck on, you know what? Be happy that you're at the dance, Holmes. That's not the game that I wanna play. And that's not the game that a lot of us want to play. The challenge is my children's generation, okay? They are so caught up into the music and they're all caught up into communications that they don't understand that that generation has got challenges beyond what I had. And they think that it's all over. They think that interracial marriages is going to make everything better. You know what? It ain't working out that way when you look at the data. Poverty rates, lack of educational opportunity, lack of health care coverage, all of those indicators, home ownership, all of those things that were a problem back then, they're no better now.
So let's go back and talk about that history. In 1967, King came to Sac State and spoke. Dr. Woods, what did he find in 1967? What was the status of the Sacramento region back then?
Well, let me first say amen to Reverend Torres.
Amen. Reverend Torres.
Amen's all the way around.
We're going to have to expand your resume.
Well, in 1967 in Sacramento, as I can recall it, there's a lot of excitement and also a lot of frustration because Sacramento was not the crest of the movement of civil rights. There were some of us who were doing some things. A lot of it was because we were not in the South. We had come out here and found out that what the action we had left at home. And so in 1967, when King came, you know, a large throng of people came to hear him.
And it was right before the launch of the Poor People's Campaign,
It was.
which he really focused on the fact that the government was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on each enemy killed in Vietnam, as opposed to $53 on each American at that time living in poverty.
That's right. As I recall, King said at that time, one of his points was that the militarism in this country with the Vietnamese War was going to kill the war on poverty. At that time, I was director of the War on Poverty. And when he said that, he's talking about me.
You were the director of the War on Poverty for?
Yeah, I was the first director of the War on Poverty in California, here in Sacramento. So when he said militarism in Vietnam is going to kill the war on poverty, at the same time, Senator Sparkman from Alabama was saying, what are we doing? We have funded a program where money is going directly from Washington to a community organization. We can't have that. And in 2 years, the war on poverty was gone. You couldn't have guns and better. But I want to get back to one other thing that Linda was saying, because when we talk about King and his memory, we always started with the dream. In the context of his life, you have to understand that King was derided. There was a lot of hostility from the corporate media in this country on King. The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post. I remember reading articles saying that he had stepped too far. He's gone too far. He needs to stay in the civil rights movement and not get involved in foreign policy. Well,
Think of that.
yeah, let's think of that. And Itman, what's his name, the FBI director.
J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, I said, this guy is crazy. You know, this is outrageous. We got to stop him. And a year later, he was stopped.
It's a very different King than 1963 King, Man of the Year, Times Man of the Year, who we're all in it together King. I Have a Dream King. And the King of 1967, when he came here, was about to, that same year, was going to go to the church and say why I oppose the war in Vietnam. And his allies that he had prior in 1963, including President Johnson, would no longer be his allies.
That's right.
All right.
At Riverside City Church
That's correct.
in New York.
That's
when he made that speech about the anti-war speech, I can recall it so much one Sunday watching Meet the Press. And they had Wilkinson, Foreman from CORE, and some of these other guys.
We are down to almost our last minute, and so I want to go. I have to end this part of the discussion because I have to get in two things. First off, Sam, your organization, MLK 365, holds events all year long celebrating the dream of Dr. King and his work. Where can people go to get that information?
They can go to www.mlk365.org. We're that group that on that day that does this thing, but it's more than a day. And for us, let me just say, it's if King were alive, and that's how this organization started, what would he do? He would build an organization to institutionalize the values. And it's not a King worship organization, but a value-based organization that hopefully builds sustainable change in America. It starts the dialogue with the young generation.
Okay, and with that, we are down to our last few seconds. One word response to this question, folks. What does King's legacy mean to you?
Methodology. He taught us that marching and doing what he did was effective, and we're still doing
Okay,
it.
that was more than one word. Arnold.
Courage and vision.
All right. Sam, you get the last word.
Vision, value, and action.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. That was an incredible conversation.
Thank you.
Hope to have you all back. Well, that is our show, and I'd like to thank our guests for talking with us today. There is lots of talk on television, but only a few places where we have the conversations that matter. I'm Scott Syfax, and you've been watching Studio Sacramento. Join us next time right here on KVIE.
I'm James Beckwith, President and CEO of Five Star Bank. As a community bank, we believe that open dialogue about the issues affecting our region is vitally important. From the economy to the environment to social issues, we look forward to the conversations and hope you'll join in.